blood, baboons and waterholes, odd jobs and strange ministries. Don't let anyone fool you about baboons. Tourists might fawn over them, but they're the vilest creatures on the planet. Violent, petty, scheming, and brutally cruel. If you were to take all the worst depravities of human beings and roll them into a single species, you'd get the baboon. I doubt that the good Lord would have created such a being unless some serious, infernal tampering fouled the gene pool down the line. The baboon, in my estimate, verges on the satanic. Consider their peculiar malice. An adult baboon has an insatiable appetite, eating up to 6 times as much as an adult human. The Gummo Highlands, where we lived, were crawling with the beasts, and they made the farmers' lives hell. As harvest time drew near, they'd gather in droves around the cornfields, leering, loitering, waiting for a moment of vulnerability so they could rush in and ravage the crop. A raid could be truly devastating for a struggling farmer. Now you could chalk this all up to normal animal behavior. After all, even elephants prey on farms and other places. Yet the baboons weren't content to just pillage and glut themselves with corn. They'd pluck one ear off the stalk, take a single bite, discard it, and do the same throughout the entire field. They reveled in their excess. What other animal is capable of such calculated spite? Because the baboons never rested, neither did the farmers. Between planting time and harvest, the fields had to be guarded 24 hours a day. Children took the day shift, keeping them from school, while their beleaguered parents stayed awake through the night, dealing with the constant threat of animal invasion, consumed their energies. The baboon's most repugnant trait, the detail that made me loathe them with a passion, was their occasional foray into carnivorousness. I knew of Gummo mothers who'd left their baby in the shade of a tree while they guarded the field. Then while their back was turned, a baboon had snatched the child and eaten it alive. My hated baboons, the farmers' intense need, and the expansion of the Gummo church all collided in the strangest ministry I'd ever launched, an extermination program. When my friend Dr. Nathan Barlow offered me a means of killing the pests by the thousands, it was no hardship. I relished the idea. Thallium sulfate is a highly toxic compound, odorless, colorless, and nearly invisible at the lethal dose. A few grains are enough to kill an adult. Dr. Barlow told me to exercise extreme caution as he handed me a jar of the deadly powder. The government officials went one step further, requiring community leaders to register their names for use of the poison in their area. If anyone mysteriously died during the extermination campaign, the courts would know who to hold responsible. The crux of the plan was to host a gibja, a feast for the local baboons, population in a given area. First of all, the farmers in the vicinity had to agree to work together on eradication. Baboons are prolific breeders, and the project would only work if everyone committed to it. The farmers would cut up bits and pieces of corn and potato, the local crops, and scatter them over a large open space. Then stand back and let the brutes descend on the feast. The baboons weren't smart enough to detect the trap, so they followed their appetite. This routine was repeated for several days. As the rumor of the gibja spread, the baboons traveled from the surrounding regions to take part in the festivities. By the 5th or 6th day, all the baboons for miles had converged on the site. A slavering, jabbering assembly, howling over their good fortune. They were about to discover the grim twist. The next day, when the farmers spread bits of corn and potato over the ground, they dipped a damp twig into the poison and touched it to each morsel. They drew back. The guests ran in again, just as before. The bigger ones ate several pieces, the smaller ones 1 or 2, but all of them partook. When they'd finished the meal, they went off to die. The toxin would take 3 days to kill them, a slow, agonizing death. By the end of the program, we'd killed some 6,000 to 10,000 baboons in Kamba Valley. The government was grateful, the community leaders were elated. An added benefit was that when the hyenas ate the baboons' carcasses, the thallium sulfate in the corpses was potent enough to kill them, eliminating any dangerous predator from the area. The program was hailed as the most useful contribution a white man has ever made. Admittedly, there was a long history of less than useful contributions. Besides being eminently practical, the extermination project was an opportunity for the gospel. As we got more invitations to come and carry out the poison feasts in more remote areas, I trained trustworthy Gummo evangelists to conduct them. One of the elders would go and organize the community. And each day, while the baboons rushed in to devour the bait, the elder would share God's love with the waiting farmers. Being an exterminator commanded respect, with such a tangible demonstration of meeting people's needs. The evangelist always had an attentive audience. Killing baboons was the most compelling thing anyone could have done to draw a crowd. And since the most plagued areas were often the ones furthest out, they were also the places least reached with the gospel. Wherever the exterminators went, the kingdom went, and the Gummo church grew. The ultimate justice, baboon-wise, came when Jean and I were living at Hamar Station in the lowlands a year or two later. I just launched the fragile agricultural experiment to feed the evangelist families who lived in the bush without a steady food source. In the natural world, the odds were stacked against success, but we felt that God was with us and blessing our attempts to grow crops in an uncertain land. The fact that we'd successfully transported a tractor, trailer, and farming equipment to this isolated valley was already miraculous. Although our first crop failed after the rains fell sporadically over 4 weeks and then stopped, a second spate of showers that year brought up what looked to be a promising yield of corn. When the corn had turned a lovely pale gold, ready for harvesting, a legion of baboons suddenly encircled the field. We were almost too late. They were already ripping open the husks by the time we realized what was happening and set the dogs on them. Thankfully, we managed to save about half the crop. The dogs, Smokey and Greta, were tall German shepherds, monsters in their own right. Smokey had repeatedly established himself as a thing to be feared by clamping his jaws onto the bare buttocks of one of the local Bonnemen who wore nothing but a loincloth. In fact, everyone but Mahe dreaded him. Mahe had a special touch and could subdue the wild creatures. The other evangelists stood in such fear of Smokey that we kept him locked up in a pen during the day, but the dogs were a tremendous asset in scaring off baboons, and we unleashed them at night to patrol the fields. After a few days, though, the baboons grew wiser. They were losing their fear of the dogs, growing more daring in their incursions. While Smokey was locked up, growling and snarling through the wire, the alpha baboon, a hulking male, climbed up on a tall acacia tree overlooking his enclosure. From the safety of this perch, he began snapping off the hard little fruits and pelting the dog below. It was infuriating and a grievous insult. The torment continued until Smokey was nearly rabid with rage. Around the same time, the troop decided it was to test the principle of strength in numbers. One day a gang of 30 or 40 baboons rushed at Greta, who was out in the fields. She turned tail and ran. A dog can run faster than a baboon, we discovered, but you knew that if they caught up with her, it would end badly. The hunting party shot off into the distance, vanished for a minute or two, then bent a wide arc back towards the compound. Greta was trying to shake them off, but they were still hot on her tail. As they drew near, Mahe decided to deploy Smokey. The male dog hadn't forgotten what he'd suffered at the hands of the large baboon, haunting the branches over his prison. He was still frothing with fury, deadly intent gleaming in his eye. As soon as Mahe opened the door, Smokey bolted towards the baboons. The baboons realized too late that they were being pursued in turn. As Smoky rushed into the middle of the troop, they scattered, but not before he'd latched onto the fleshy red rump of the largest, his erstwhile tormentor. Propelled by terror and sheer pain, the baboon ran up a tree, using his strong forearms to get as high as he could, and pulling the dog up with him into the air. Smoky held on, teeth burrowed deep into the monkey's posterior, and they stayed suspended in this excruciating stalemate for a few moments. We had a strong older gardener named Badro, a man who'd been in prison for several years. He'd been swinging a 4-pronged pitchfork when the baboon came near the crops. Now he took his weapon and ran to the tree. The baboon was still struggling to escape Smoky, who was still hanging on off his nether parts. Badro took aim, let the pitchfork fly. It sailed through the air and pierced the baboon through the neck, stapling him to the tree trunk. The prongs disengaged from the wood, and the baboon left a bloody trail as it slid down the tree, not quite dead. The execution was local partnership at its finest. Everyone played a part. After Smoky had been restrained, 2 Borno warriors came running up with spears to end the baboon's life. It was over quickly. They each carved off one hairy 15-pound leg, taking the meat home for supper. One of the most thrilling aspects of following Jesus is ending up in strange, unforeseen roles. We frequently takes us past the parameters we've set for our ministries and careers, to predictable boundaries based on skills and qualifications, and into unconventional tasks. Not all of them are as dramatic as baboon extermination, but the outcomes are equally wonderful. On my second mule trek into the lowlands, we were passing through the Tsamai people's territory to get to the Bunners. Tsamai lived on a great plain about 50 miles long and 20 wide, whose appearance changed drastically depending on the season. Most of the year, the land is dry, devoid of any visible water, but when the rains come, lush, beautiful grasses spring up, transforming the desert into a meadow for 3 months. Since I'd already been that way once before, I felt confident that we wouldn't need a guide this time. The trails were straightforward. The 2 other men trusted me and we went without a local guide. But my prior visit in the dry season hadn't prepared me for what the bush would look like after a bit of precipitation. It was a different world altogether. Tall grass shot up around us, obscuring our view, and the old trails were completely grown over. We wandered around for a while, making our best guess as to what constituted a path, and at last we stumbled on a well I'd passed the last time. It was choked with rocks. We were told later that the Tsamai and the Bunna were at war, and each had filled in the wells between them to cut off the other's water supply, preventing an advancing war party from reaching them. Now I was worried. We were running out of water, and I'd counting on being able to refill at the well. There was nothing that looked like a path in any direction. Apparently no one had been this way for months. We found out from the well and were scanning the ground for signs of human presence when one of my companions called us over. He'd spotted what looked like tire tracks. Tire tracks? In this isolated valley, no vehicle ever passed this way. But he was right. 2 patterned parallel grooves indented the soil. The distinctive heavy tread gave them away as belonging to a police truck. We traced them back, following them for miles until we came to an established trail. It was another instance of God's perfect timing, His rescue. I discovered that no vehicle had ever been through the plain until 3 months before, when a policeman had driven in with local leaders in an attempt to mediate between the warring groups. The day they arrived, though, it rained so hard that the truck got stuck. He'd had to forego the peacemaking ceremony and turn back. And if it had rained after that, his tracks would have melted away, leaving us to wander through the grass for untold hours or days. During my trips through my territory, I noticed the women digging shallow holes in the earth, about 1 foot deep and 10 feet wide. They'd learned that when the rains came, the holes would collect enough water to tide their cattle over for 2 or 3 days. Otherwise the beasts would have to walk 20 miles to the nearest water source. All the women had to dig with, though, was a pointed stick, the height of Tsamai technology. Theirs was an isolated bush society with no exposure to the outside world. All they owned were whatever they could cut, mould or whittle from their immediate environments. This is where appropriate development comes in. If an intervention doesn't take into account the level of people's technology and how they already interact with the land, it ends up being irrelevant at best, disastrous at worst. Once I'd got to know the Tsamai chiefs and elders, I shared my idea. I see that your women know how to dig holes when it's dry to catch the water, but they could dig much deeper, bigger holes if they had a steel shovel and hoe. I brought one of each to exhibit. With your permission, I could bring in more of these, and they're all made in Ethiopia. These aren't white people's imports, they're from your own land. The elders discussed this at length, how they distribute the tools, what the consequences might be for the Tsamai. They agreed to my proposal, but added their own innovation. The people already had a sort of homemade adze that they could use to shape wood. If I brought in the steel heads, they would craft the handles themselves. They'd found a way to marry their traditional craft to the new technology. When I solicited a well-known secular agency for funds, the $2,000 or so we'd need for shovel and hoe heads, and presented a map of the sites where holes could be dug, they responded with a characteristically Western approach to progress. Yes, it's a great idea, but why don't we just fly in a bulldozer? We could dig those holes in a couple of days. You could, I replied, but I already knew what'll happen. When those holes silt up in a year's time, and the people can't dig them out, they'll ask you to send the bulldozer again, but you won't. They already know how to dig a hole. If we help them get shovels, they'll know how to maintain it. Developing countries are littered with the bones of abandoned projects. Nearly all of them started by well-meaning, well-financed Westerners. In every case, the facilities, equipment, or infrastructure proved impossible for local people to maintain without access to the same funds, services, replacement parts, or expertise. When the Western funders withdrew, the project dried up. After many years of pioneering primitive technology projects in rural Africa, I've learned that the soundest principle is to help communities move just one step further than where they are now, from sticks to shovels. My people had agreed to clear an airstrip for the drop-off, and on my next visit I flew in the shovel and hoe heads, 100 of each. The community got to work. What I hadn't anticipated was that the new technology would create a social revolution. The men who'd never stooped to do such manual tasks now had their hands on high technology and decided that women wouldn't be allowed to touch it. In a single day, the gender roles had flipped. For the first time in their lives, the men worked. They're now in the trenches, eagerly hefting earth, honing their technique. I watched the going-ons with great enjoyment, coaching them how to toss the loose earth as far as possible from the hole. It was dicey being in range before they had fully mastered the art. Since they'd never used such tools and were apt to let go of the handle when flinging the dirt, thankfully no one caught a flying shovel in the head. I made a competition out of it. You know, I said, looking serious, those other people have dug a much deeper hole, much deeper. You'd better take a look. A man would go running off to the nearest hole a mile or two away to see how the rival teams were faring. He'd come running back. Yes, you're right, it is deeper. Everybody keep digging. I never did get to see the rains come. When the communist revolution engulfed Ethiopia a month or two later, all the missionaries were forced out. It was 17 years before I could return, one of the first white people allowed back. The nation was still reeling from the old regime, from the senseless killings and expropriations of land, the bark propaganda, the frenzied, overzealous attempts to right past wrongs. Travel was difficult amid so much administrative turmoil, but I still knew many government officials in various parts of the country who could help me get from point to point. On my way to the Omo Valley to see the work amongst the Bana, I crossed my land again. As I drove over the mountain pass and into the plain, I could see the clumps of tall trees where years before there'd been none. I marvelled. They'd grown up exactly where the people had dug the water holes, creating little oases across the bush. I drove closer to get a better look and found a local man who could tell me the story of the trees. When the holes had filled with rainwater, the birds came down to drink, leaving their droppings around the perimeter. Those droppings contained seeds, and the seeds grew into trees. That's how I knew the value of the trees and didn't cut them down. Not only did the shade prevent the water in the holes from evaporating so quickly, but it was also a boon to the cattle. When the cows had drunk deeply, they'd stand sluggishly around the edge of the pond, quivering, trying to digest the water, and they preferred to be out of the sun. But the greatest benefit of all was that the trees brought more rain to the region. The whole plain had greened as a result. The Creator had turned our modest water collective initiative into a full-blown forestation project. Of all the Omo Valley's diverse ethnic groups, the Mursi are probably the most photographed and publicized today. Tourists willingly endure the long, rugged overland journey to see Mursi women wearing lip plates, large discs inserted into the lower lip that stretch the skin to incredible lengths. As in many other parts of the world, the effects of globalization on the Omo Valley have been overwhelmingly negative, creating a culture of dependency, exploitation, and catering to the tastes of Westerners who come to gawk at the exotic local habits of dress and ornamentation. Years before the tourist race began in earnest, I was asked to clear an airstrip in Mursiland by the tireless Dr. Barlow, he of the baboon poisoning scheme, who dedicated his life to improving medical care for rural Ethiopians and showing them the love of Jesus. He is retiring from the continent in a few weeks and wanted to visit the Mursi one more time. I once started something there, he said cryptically, and I'd like to see what God has done to move it forward. Mursi country was just north of Bunaland and I'd never been before. I was able to drive my Land Rover and then take a mule the rest of the way in. When I arrived, I repeated the familiar process of finding a long level patch of ground, clearing the thorn bushes and lining the edges with rocks to mark the strip. I'd learned long ago not to paint the rocks. The local communities liked the white coating and would take whatever it plied for decor. So I resorted to my usual practice of wrapping the rocks in toilet paper, equally visible from the air but worthless to those on the ground. As I was clearing one day, a few local men walked over and greeted me through my interpreter. This man, they announced, presenting an older Mursi gentleman, is one of your people. What do you mean? Well, he has white man's blood in him, so that makes him one of your brothers, doesn't it? He doesn't look like one of my brothers. Ah, we'll tell you the story, they answered. A long time ago, there was a terrible sickness among us that killed many of our people. We had no medicine, no way to heal ourselves, but we knew of a clinic a few days away, so we sent some of our strongest men to get medicine. They walked for 4 days, crossing enemy territory twice, mostly by night to avoid being seen. When they arrived at the clinic, the white doctor was there. He said he didn't have the medicine except in his blood. He was carrying it inside him. He said that if he gave them his blood, there was a chance that they might be healed. So they took his blood and walked back. This man was one of them. He still has white man's blood in his veins. So that makes him your brother, doesn't it? There could only have been one clinic and one doctor in those days. I had to hear the rest. When Dr. Barlow and his wife flew in a few days later, Planning to spend a full 2 weeks amongst the local people, I feigned ignorance. Before I took the return flight out, we sat together for tea, and I brought up casually, innocently, "Nathan, I heard the strangest thing the other day while I was clearing the airstrip. I met a Morsi man who said he had a white man's blood in him. How can that be?" He flushed, hesitating. The secret was out. "Yes, I remember that, and I'll tell you," he said, "but don't repeat this to anyone till after I'm dead. Medically, it was a very improper thing for me to do." When those men showed up at my door, 7 of them, I believe, they looked terrible. We could only speak through my interpreter, and they didn't know what the sickness was called. But I myself had had the vaccine. I realized that the only hope for their survival was if I gave them my own blood. I made it very clear that there was a risk. If the bloods were incompatible, the transfer could kill them. They all agreed to do it regardless. I prayed hard before I drew my blood. I took as much as I could until I started feeling lightheaded, then let it sit overnight. By morning the serum had separated out on top. After I'd ejected each of them, they went back the way they'd come, and I never learned the rest. I've always wondered. That's why I asked you to help me return here, to see what God has done. "Nathan," I said, "they remember you. There's at least one man still living. This is the perfect time to tell them about the blood of Jesus." A crowd gathered to see the revered Dr. Barlow. The older ones remembered him from many years ago, when he was the only doctor for hundreds of miles. The younger ones knew him as a figure in legend. I can still recall the look of wonder on their faces, the sheer astonishment, as Dr. Barlow spoke in his quiet, gentle way about the blood that truly gives life. Who knows where following Jesus will take us, or what strange occupations he has in store? God leads us by the ways we don't know. The path we first set out on, thinking we know where we are going, intersects with other paths we didn't dream of, hidden trails for the gospel that the Lord has already cleared and that we have only to stumble upon. To change the metaphor, consider the trees around some ice ponds again. Our vision is so small compared to the Lord's. Where we imagine a hole in the ground, a hole that we might not even get to see filled with water, he sees a haven for the birds and cattle, a garden in the desert. The growth of the kingdom is largely mysterious to us, just as Jesus told us it would be. A man scatters seed on the ground. Night and day, whether he sleeps or gets up, the seed sprouts and grows, though he does not know how. Mark 4:26 and 27.